Winter 1877, Cedar Creek, Indiana. A bitterly cold winter and a grisly discovery that forever tarnishes the faith of an entire community. When a substitute teacher named Margaret Wilson takes up her post in the mining town of Cedar Creek, she has no idea that she is about to open the door to one of the darkest secrets in the history of the Methodist Church. Over the course of 2 years, 50 children have disappeared from the area's most beloved Bible school. They had been on the roll, had attended regular Sunday morning services. But strangely, not a single family remembered having one. And what she finds under the church's wooden floorboards exposes a systematic horror, a crime so sophisticated that local authorities were forced to cover it up for decades. Tonight's Sleepy History Tales invites you into Cedar Creek's most closely guarded secret. Before we continue our journey with Margaret Wilson and the children who placed their trust in her, I must warn you, this channel is not for the faint of heart. This is a place for those who dare to confront the dark side of American history, where religion, power, and darkness come together. If you're ready to explore the stories that most channels don't dare tell, hit that subscribe button and let me know which state you're listening from, because the next investigation will change the way you view a church forever. Margaret's investigation didn't just expose the evil deeds of a few individuals. It exposed the organized complicity of an entire community who looked the other way as long as the crimes didn't disturb the surface. Cedar Creek sits in the heart of Indiana's coal mining country, where the Methodist faith runs as deep as the black mine shafts beneath their feet. By 1876, the town had nearly 3,000 residents, mostly religious families, drawn by the steady work provided by the booming railroad and coal mines that connected Indiana's resources to the needs of big cities like Chicago. When the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad reached Cedar Creek in 1871, the sleepy farming town quickly became a bustling industrial center. And with that growth, underlying conflicts began to emerge. Waves of Irish and German immigrants brought Catholic and Lutheran faiths, which contrasted with the local Protestant majority. Denominations like Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians competed not only for followers, but also for social influence and business opportunities, as religion now determined status in the community. Cedar Creek's First Methodist Church is the pride of the town, a majestic limestone structure with 2 bell towers that echo across the fields. Completed in 1874 with generous donations from merchants and mine owners, it symbolizes Methodist cultural leadership as the town changes. With Gothic Revival architecture, stained glass, imported from Cincinnati, and a modern steam heating system, it is the most advanced religious institution in Hamilton County. Every Sunday morning, the church is packed and the sound of children singing hymns echoes. But what really sets First Methodist apart is its Sunday school program, a place where every parent wants to send their child. The head of the program is Margaret Wilson, a stern 42-year-old who arrived from Pennsylvania 5 years ago. She has transformed a small group of local children into more than 200 students from surrounding counties. Parents did not hesitate to travel dozens of miles on muddy roads by horse-drawn carriage just to let their children study with Mrs. Wilson, who was hailed as a saint of education in central Indiana, with a solid knowledge of the Bible, iron discipline, and the ability to reform unruly children, she quickly won the trust of everyone. With experience teaching at industrial schools in Philadelphia, she had an excellent grasp of the psychology of children, regardless of family background or educational level. Next to Margaret was assistant Sarah Coleman, a gentle 38-year-old woman who had never been married. Sarah seemed to have an invisible miracle. With just a soft voice and a tolerant look, she could magically soothe little souls. Sarah Coleman, a gentle woman with a smile that radiated compassion, joined the program 2 years after Margaret arrived at Cedar Creek. She had previously worked at a Methodist mission station in Cincinnati, caring for orphans, where she had built a reputation for impeccable records and unquestioning devotion to child welfare. In the eyes of the community, Sarah and Margaret were an ideal couple symbolizing God's love for little souls. Supervising them was Robert Hayes, a wealthy merchant in his mid-50s who had a wide influence in the town and was the church's largest benefactor. He owned 3 coal mines, 2 grain silos, and Cedar Creek's largest general store. Hayes's election to the church board was unanimous, and his generous contributions not only built additional classrooms, but paved the way for innovative curriculums that attracted parents from far-flung counties. But what made Cedar Creek's Sunday school program legendary throughout Hamilton County were its Bible tours, an unprecedented initiative. These were not just short field trips. They were week-long journeys that combined Bible study with visits to historic sites, old churches, museums, and even meetings with prominent Methodist clergy and scholars from across the Midwest. The trips were promoted as windows to the world for children growing up in poverty and the monotony of rural life. Word spread, and parents from neighboring counties sought to enroll their children, seeing it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Articles appeared in evangelical magazines hailing Cedar Creek as a model of excellence in religious education for rural children. In the Protestant community, where education and character development are 2 sacred pillars, Margaret's model was not only accepted, it was hailed as a guiding light. Since the time of John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, the combination of scripture and knowledge has been seen as the true path to salvation. In an era when most children were deprived of formal education, the promise of luxurious educational trips became the dream of thousands of poor families. Word spread. Margaret Wilson's reputation spread beyond Indiana. It was said that she could reform even the most misbehaving children with faith and discipline. Letters of recommendation from Methodist leaders in Philadelphia, where she had helped drastically reduce juvenile delinquency in the poor industrial working class, attested to her talents. Margaret's method, combining strict discipline with a broad vision, was perfect for a town reeling from the social upheaval of post-industrialization. Her arrival in Cedar Creek was timely. After the financial crisis of 1873, many families were in dire straits. Margaret's program, with its promise of a better future for their children, seemed the only way out for desperate but ambitious parents. Many borrowed money, even sold small possessions, just so their children could go on one of Margaret Wilson's trips. But because they were organized by the church, which was considered pious and holy, no one suspected anything. The prestige of the Methodist Church, coupled with the town's public support of the wealthiest, meant that any dissent was either silenced or viewed as ungrateful to those who were giving the opportunity. In the eyes of society at that time, if your child did not participate, you were missing out on a privilege from God. And the program didn't stop at Cedar Creek. Margaret Wilson began casting a wide net, reaching out to small churches in surrounding towns, inviting them to send their children on trips as an act of community service. For families living in places even poorer than Cedar Creek, it was an invitation from heaven. The region-wide approach not only attracted hundreds of potential students, but also inadvertently or intentionally blurred the trail. With each child coming from a different community, no one had enough information to notice similarities or suspect anything unusual. It was a perfect structure designed to isolate paralyzed response and plug the loopholes in surveillance. The first disappearance occurred in September 1876. But at the time, no one called it a disappearance. 8-year-old Timothy Morrison was selected to attend a study tour of the ancient Bible at a newly discovered archaeological site near Louisville. His parents were newly arrived German immigrants who worked at Robert Hayes's new coal mine. Their English was poor. Their hearts were anxious about the future, so when Margaret Wilson presented the opportunity with enthusiasm and tactful sincerity, they nodded with tears in their eyes, believing that a miracle had occurred. Timothy was an excellent student, intelligent beyond his years, and had a special memory for scripture. Margaret explained that a Methodist family specializing in biblical archaeology in Kentucky had set their sights on the boy. They wanted Timothy to help them with their research, while receiving advanced training, perhaps becoming a missionary or religious scholar in the future. A sacred honor, not only for Timothy, but for Cedar Creek. The Morrisons were promised regular correspondence, and that in 2 years, Timothy would return, bringing with him knowledge and opportunities they had never dreamed of. For a poor immigrant family, this was the answer to years of silent prayers. In town, Timothy's departure was hardly noticed. His parents were more proud than worried. Margaret's letter was clear and thoughtful, making even the most skeptical neighbors nod in agreement. The boy was indeed chosen by God. He was quiet and read a lot, so his absence did not cause any disturbance in the classroom. Just 2 weeks later, 10-year-old Mary Catherine Phillips set out on another trip, this time to serve in distant missionary settlements. Her mother was a widow who struggled to support her 3 children by working as a laundress. When told that Mary Catherine would be learning teaching skills and helping to establish Sunday schools in areas without churches, her mother wept with emotion. Mary Catherine was well-liked, intelligent, steady, and always helping the children with their Bible studies. Margaret explained that a Methodist missionary organization in Illinois had singled out a capable girl to help her family move west. The trip was not only an educational opportunity, but also the beginning of a career in teaching or evangelism. 2 paths that would bring financial stability and social prestige to a girl who had known only the stain on her mother's sleeve. For a widow living in anxiety, it was an intervention from heaven. By Christmas 1876, 6 more children had left Cedar Creek on special educational trips. Each followed a familiar and suspicious pattern. Chosen for outstanding achievement, promised a unique educational journey. The family was assured of regular correspondence, and in the end, Not a single letter arrived. When parents asked, Margaret smiled patiently. They are working very hard. They can't write often. Gradually, the community stopped asking. But behind the moral veneer, behind the prayers and the inspiring curriculum, was a sophisticated system of fraud. The selection of students was not based on achievement or spiritual potential. The educational trips did not lead to museums, ancient churches, or new lands. They were to a place of darkness that was never allowed to be named. The genius of Margaret Wilson's system lay not in any pedagogical curriculum, but in its ability to exploit the town's deep-seated parental aspirations and social expectations. In Cedar Creek, where the dream of a better life could only be achieved through the church, the opportunity for a child to rise by faith was the greatest hope a family could cling to. To question that opportunity was to deny God's grace, or worse, to threaten the chances of other children. And so, silence was accepted as gratitude. But it was Ellen Hartwell, a commoner, who first saw the logic behind the nightmare machine. The selection of children for special education trips had nothing to do with academic achievement or spiritual life. Instead, Margaret and Sarah had developed a cold, selective system that played on the fragility and vulnerability of families. The first criterion, family circumstances. Children from immigrant families were always favored. Limited language skills, cultural differences, and a wariness of religious authorities made parents less likely to question or protest. Newcomers to town with no friends, relatives, or deep social connections were especially ideal targets, since no one but them would notice if a child suddenly disappeared. The second criterion, financial desperation. Impoverished families often saw any opportunity as salvation, and so they rarely asked questions, fearing that doing so would mean losing their only blessing. Widows, manual laborers, large families, all were on the list that Margaret and Sarah had quietly compiled like a map of human exploitation. Then came the final criterion, the child's value in the black market that Margaret had been quietly cultivating for years. Young, strong boys were often sent to factories and mines, where their small bodies were better suited to squeeze into spaces that adults could not. Older, good-looking girls who could read and write were presented to households in need of domestic help, where their services went far beyond washing or cooking. Intelligence thought to be an asset was often seen as a liability. Children who were too smart were more likely to ask questions, find ways to hide, or worse, send letters asking for help. Margaret preferred well-behaved, docile children, smart enough to be valuable, but manageable enough to not cause trouble. The Sunday school program was the perfect laboratory for observing children. There, Margaret and Sarah watched for personality behavior and emotional responses and decided who would be chosen. Sarah, with her gentle demeanor and prayerful voice, could get any child to confide everything from their fears to their deepest dreams. She would spend hours in private conversations, calling them pastoral care and education, but in reality, she was digging for information to decide their fate. The winter of 1866-77 marked the beginning of the expansion of the campaign. Margaret Wilson had established links with similar programs within the Methodist church systems in Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. This network allowed her to transport children across state lines, making tracking nearly impossible. This expansion was no accident. It coincided perfectly with the boom in railroad infrastructure, which allowed long-distance travel to be faster and less conspicuous than ever before. And Robert Hayes, the businessman behind the church, was the one who paved the way for it all. With business connections in shipping coal and agricultural products, he had a logistics network that stretched across the Midwest. Many partners were willing to assist with special shipments as long as they received favorable terms from Hayes. His cover of legal business, from coal mines to warehouses, from railways to churches, allowed the trafficking of children to be carried out in broad daylight without any suspicion from railway staff or police. The financial returns from this network far exceeded all initial expectations. The proceeds were enough to fund significant expansions to the church's facilities and educational programs. For those behind the scheme, it was a virtuous cycle on the surface, of course. Crime generated profit. Profit built the church. The church became famous. The fame attracted more parents and children, which in turn concealed the crime more effectively. A perfect, hypocritical, but coldly effective cycle. The church's newly constructed basement, funded by a donation from Robert Hayes, contained secret rooms and vaults areas that no one outside the inner circle was allowed access to. By the spring of 1877, the program had enrolled children from more than a dozen different communities, with families traveling more than 30 miles to have their children enrolled in this prestigious educational program. The geographic dispersion was key to crippling the ability to track or question. Parents in different towns did not know each other, did not communicate, and each thought, only my child gets picked. No one suspected. No one connected the dots. And if they did, the religious prestige of the program made any questioning easy to dismiss as unbelief or petty. But what kept the whole system running was not Margaret, but someone far more dangerous and calculating, Sarah Coleman. As trafficking networks in major cities began to notice the quality of Cedar Creek's input, Margaret's reputation spread through underground channels. Healthy, literate, well-educated children not sought after too long. A premium product for the black market with pre-orders and sky-high prices. From an opportunistic profiteering model, the Cedar Creek network evolved into a professional trafficking system run like a clandestine religious enterprise. It was Sarah Coleman's personal diary, later discovered by Ellen Hartwell, that shed light on the psychology behind the entire network. In contrast to Margaret, who was driven by greed, Sarah was fascinated by the manipulation of human psychology. She kept detailed notes on each child's personality strengths, weaknesses, fears, emotional responses. The diary pages read like a clinical psychology textbook, a dark version. Sarah developed a method of separating children from their families, testing their ability to adapt to different types of work, and adjusting the program to prevent escape or rebellion. Her gentle demeanor was the perfect cover for a cold, manipulative, and emotionless mind. A chilling diary entry tells of 12-year-old Anna Kowalski, who was chosen for missionary training, an honor her Polish immigrant parents considered a divine gift. Sarah describes how she gradually separated Anna from her parents with gentle but poisonous words, that they were too poor, too rustic, unworthy of raising a child with such a spiritual bent. By the time Anna left, she believed that abandoning her parents was God's will. Sarah didn't just manipulate individual children, she fooled the entire community. She built a system of false correspondence. Parents received handwritten letters written by their children about lessons learned, gratitude, and promises to return. All were Sarah's creations, both in writing and in content. The letters quelled any suspicions, discouraged parents from questioning them, and created a layer of legitimacy that would protect the program if anyone investigated. Even more frightening, Sarah applied her psychological manipulation techniques to adults. She identified influential figures in the community, teachers, business people, prominent parents, and built personal managed relationships to maintain support and prevent backlash. Sarah Coleman's diaries contain more than just psychological profiles of children. She also kept detailed profiles of community leaders, including their personal ambitions, family weaknesses, and business interests that could be exploited to keep them in check. The notes were chillingly accurate. Every word, every political leaning, even family arguments were recorded, analyzed, and used as bargaining chips by the hidden power holders. But in January 1878, tragedy struck, at least for the organization's machinery. Sarah Coleman fell ill, diagnosed by the local doctor as having tuberculosis consumption, a disease not uncommon in those days, but extremely dangerous if not treated properly. The timing was terrible. The program was about to embark on one of its biggest campaigns ever, with plans to distribute nearly 30 children to multiple locations across the Midwest before spring, when the roads became difficult to navigate. Sarah's absence paralyzed the system. No one but her knew the psychological profiles of each child, the network of parents, and the detailed schedules of the trips. Margaret Wilson, who had been used to sharing the work, was now left to shoulder the burden. Meanwhile, Robert Hayes kept up the pressure, demanding that the program continue on schedule despite the staffing crisis. And then, as a temporary solution, the church board decided to hire Ellen Hartwell, 24, a recent graduate of Indiana State Teachers College, a young, enthusiastic, well-trained teacher who no one expected was the cure to the nightmare that had lasted for the past 2 years. Ellen Hartwell grew up in a Methodist family in southern Indiana. Her father was an itinerant preacher, and her mother taught in local church schools. Teaching was more than a career dream. It was a calling. She wanted to improve the quality of religious education for rural children. Ellen arrived at Cedar Creek with genuine enthusiasm. The educational program here had a reputation that was well known in the Methodist community, and she believed she was about to join an outstanding example of faith and wisdom. At first, everything seemed like a dream. The children were polite. The Bible was memorized. The classrooms were modern. The facilities were well equipped. The parents were active. The community was supportive. But Ellen was not just a believer. She was trained to be skeptical. Having been formally educated, Ellen did not look at a classroom with admiration, but with professional standards. What were the learning objectives? Where were the previous year's syllabus? Where were the follow-up tests and letters? When she asked to see student evaluation records, correspondence, and progress tracking documents, Margaret Wilson simply smiled politely and said, "Our program is quite unique, not like a traditional school." Those documents were kept private for sensitive reasons. The answer seemed reasonable until Ellen started planning lessons. As Ellen developed a continuation curriculum for the students who were still in school, she realized there was no information about the content of the departed students. There were no program descriptions, no assignments, no notes. Ensuring continuity in learning became an impossible task. Margaret simply said, "Those students are doing very specialized programs that are not related to the general curriculum." But that did not assuage Ellen's growing suspicions. One day, during a casual conversation with longtime parishioners, Ellen happened to mention a few names of students who had gone on the special trip. But the response she got was silence, confusion, and avoidance. It seemed that the town had forgotten those children. The names that their parents had once spoken with pride had been quietly erased from the community's memory. When Ellen asked for letters and updates from the children, people would just smile and change the subject. Ellen began to realize that she had walked into something wrong. She remembered the lessons she had learned in school about the signs of educational fraud, institutional abuse, and the hidden systems in religious settings. Those lessons were no longer on paper. They were alive, happening, and she, a young teacher who had been assigned to temporarily replace, was now the only one who could expose the truth. What Ellen observed at Cedar Creek began to overlap alarmingly with the warning signs she had been trained to recognize: poor record keeping, reluctance to provide documentation, defensive responses to reasonable questions, and systematic isolation of students from the outside world. These were all red flag signs that could not be ignored. The first confrontation between Ellen and Margaret Wilson took place in February 1878. Ellen had prepared a letter intended to be sent to families hosting students on long-term field trips in hopes of establishing contact between the children and their old friends. In prestigious educational programs, this was professional practice to maintain emotional connections and assess academic progress from a distance. But Margaret's response was extremely harsh. She insisted that any contact would disrupt the education and could break the trusting relationships with the foster families. According to Margaret, the families had requested no outside interference so that the children could fully integrate into their new environment. Ellen was strictly forbidden from contacting the absent students and was warned that further interference would cost her her position and damage the reputation of the entire program. Ellen's wariness turned to determination. She began sending letters to Methodist parishes in the cities that were supposed to be receiving Cedar Creek students. And then the responses came back, polite but confused, sincere but bewildered. None of the churches had ever heard of Cedar Creek's exchange program, nor had any students from Indiana come to the extent Margaret Wilson described. Ellen's investigation took a critical turn when she began examining the financial records of the educational program. As a professional, she knew that legitimate exchange programs come with detailed expense accounts, insurance agreements, and transparent contracts between participating entities. But at Cedar Creek, there were none. Robert Hayes had long been hailed as a model philanthropist, a wealthy man devoted to public education. But the financial records Ellen uncovered told a different story. Large sums of money were flowing in and out of the program's accounts. without detailed descriptions, no receipts, without a trace of where the money went or from whom. Worse, Ellen began to notice suspicious personal financial changes among the leadership team. Margaret Wilson had just purchased a large plot of land in Cedar Creek and was discussing real estate investments in California. Sarah Coleman, though a modest teacher, was able to afford long-term treatment at a high-end medical facility in Chicago. Robert Hayes was opening a chain of stores, investing in new mines in neighboring towns, and expanding his personal business empire. In the eyes of Ellen, who had grown up in a poor pastoral family and had seen many church teachers struggle to make ends meet, this lavish lifestyle was far beyond what was considered acceptable. The rapid coincidental rise of the program's executives could not have been accidental. And then the straw that broke the camel's back. One Wednesday evening after the service, Ellen overheard Margaret Wilson and Robert Hayes talking in the church basement. They thought no one was there. But Ellen was packing up papers behind the altar, and their whispers echoed through the thin wooden walls. They talked about shipments, accounts, and contacts in Chicago, completely unrelated to any educational content or discussion of the curriculum. Their tone was urgent and furtive. Not a word was said about the Bible, the sermon, or the students. Ellen stood in the darkness, her heart pounding her hands, clutching the file, and knew she was dealing with something far greater than anything she had ever been trained to handle. The conversations Ellen overheard were no longer vague. These were not educational discussions. They were business negotiations. They spoke of shipping prices, schedules, and partners in Chicago in the tone of someone running a living transportation business, not a church education program. And on the night of March 15, 1878, Ellen Hartwell made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She took the key, which had been given in trust, and quietly opened the door to the church's education wing after the evening service. The building was dark, and the hissing of the steam heating system sounded like someone's breathing in the walls. The wind beat against the windows like the knocking of forgotten children. The oil lamp in Ellen's hand gave off a weak light, casting trembling shadows on the walls. The familiar classrooms had suddenly become a maze of death. She began with Margaret Wilson's private office, a neat room smelling of old paper and polished wood. But under a loose floorboard, Ellen found something that did not belong in any church that had ever existed: a leather-bound book, old but sturdy. Not a diary, not a lesson plan. A trading book, a true ledger. And inside, the truth burst forth like a muffled scream, page by page, carefully recorded, not of the Bible, but of the people being sold. Timothy Morrison. 8 strong, well-behaved German boy, poor English, sold for 85 to the Chicago textile interest. Mary Catherine Phillips. 10. Intelligent, capable of leadership, widowed mother, poor circumstances, bought by the Louisville Family Service for $120. Each child was valued as a commodity. Age, health, intelligence, personality, family background, all were ranked like in a pet book. The more Ellen read, the more she couldn't breathe. The columns of addresses appeared like a matrix: Chicago, Louisville, Cincinnati, St. Louis. Next to them were the codes, the aliases of the people who were in charge of the shipment, the transportation, the paperwork, the transactions. The most brutal part was the financial summary. In just 2 years, the trio Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, Robert Hayes had earned more than $4,000 from selling children. That was an amount that a poor family in Cedar Creek could not have dreamed of in their entire lives. Moreover, many vague notes implied that these were only on-the-books transactions. The rest were cash off-the-grid agents and closed-door agreements. But Ellen didn't stop there. In the cellar, she found a stack of fake letters written in an eerily similar handwriting. Letters from the children sent home talking about how wonderful life was, new lessons learned, and thanking God for this opportunity. They were all fake: a writer, a script, a coldly calculated lie. The letters stressed that the children were too busy studying to come home, and that too much contact would affect their spiritual transformation. Some even advised their parents to stop writing. It was a poisonous sedative, soothing suspicion, perpetuating false beliefs, and buying time for the crime to continue. Ellen opened the locked drawer and discovered the contract. They were disguised in bureaucratic language. But anyone who had ever read a legal document knew this was a contract for the sale of child labor. Every line of sign, every terms of supply, every safe transport clause alluded to a professional network where children were merchandise and women in skirts preaching were cold-blooded businessmen. Ellen Hartwell, who had come to Cedar Creek to teach the Bible, now stood before a hell disguised as heaven. She no longer doubted. She knew, and she understood. If she kept quiet, she would be safe. If she spoke out, she could lose everything. The contracts Ellen found were more than signatures. They had payment terms, delivery dates, and a return policy. If a child did not fit the job requirements, they could be sent back. Not people, goods. The most damning evidence came from private letters. Margaret Wilson's letters sent to clients in Chicago, Louisville, Cincinnati. The language was no longer ambiguous. Their requests were clear. Male, 9'11", in good health, well-behaved. No strong reactions when away from home. Female, 12-14, literate, appears to be religious. A nice smile is a plus. Additional payment incentives were offered for children who were good, obedient, and easy to manage. A Chicago textile mill owner wrote a letter of praise for a high-end shipment. Children from Cedar Creek work better, complain less than Ohio. Another letter from a Louisville family service agency described the need. Preferably a well-mannered, well-behaved girl. Don't speak your native language if you're an immigrant. We need one who listens. Ellen read this and understood. Not all the children were forced to work. Some were no longer children. And then, in the basement storage room behind a false brick-and-mortar wall, she found Sarah Coleman's notebook, the gentlest woman in the church, the one who held the children when they cried, the one who said, "God loves good children." Sarah's diary did not contain prayers. It was a psychological analysis of a criminal. She wrote about each child as if she were experimenting in a laboratory. Lois, highly suggestible through praise, easily made to believe her mother didn't love her enough. Thomas, fearful of the dark, can use nighttime separation to create attachment disorder. Johann believes obedience is the only path to heaven. Easily programmed. Sarah wasn't sick. She wasn't cured. She was in Chicago closing the biggest deal of her criminal career. The network Ellen uncovered wasn't just a threesome. It was a network of interstate human trafficking stretching from Indiana to Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Missouri. A spider's web where the children were the pupae and the blood-sucking insects were the teachers, businessmen, sponsors. Cedar Creek, which seemed like a place of faith, was a transit hub. Children from other states were brought in temporarily while the original facility was under investigation. Children from Cedar Creek were exported again as the pressure mounted. The regional arrangement, according to the letters, was there is always a place to take them. Just keep quiet. They have no papers to prove their identity. God will not check Ellen Hartwell. With her lamp, burning low her hands, shaking, standing in the face of the dirtiest truth ever hidden in the house of God. No more doubt, no more pretense, no more retreat. The final transaction was in motion. A bulk sale of over 30 children destined for factories, homes, and far darker places across the Midwest, but hidden in Sarah Coleman's papers. Ellen found something that struck her harder than any contract or ledger letters. Tiny, fragile scraps of human desperation, testimonies from children who had tried and failed to reach home. Their messages had never arrived. They were intercepted, preserved, catalogued, insurance in case any member of the trafficking network considered betraying the others. One note, written in a child's careful, trembling handwriting, read, "Mama, they told me you didn't want me anymore because I was bad. I work in the big building with the loud machines. My hands hurt all the time, and I am so tired. Please come get me. I promise I'll be good." The message was marked with the Chicago address. Beside it, in Sarah's gold notation, "Intercepted before delivery," another letter torn at the edges appeared to be part of a longer plea. The lady here says, "I have to be grateful for my food and bed, but she makes me do things that feel wrong. I remember what you taught me about right and wrong. She says God wants me to obey. I'm scared. I want to come home." Sarah had labeled the handwriting herself, Mary Catherine Phillips. These were not just letters. They were evidence of psychological warfare. Children had been systematically broken down, told their parents had abandoned them, taught that their suffering was a punishment from God, conditioned to believe that obedience was the only path to redemption. The very faith that brought their families to the church was turned against them. As Ellen sifted through the files, a terrible realization settled in. The conspirators were preparing to vanish entirely. The children weren't just trafficked. They were being erased. The financial records confirmed it. Margaret Wilson had already purchased land near San Francisco under a false name. Robert Hayes was liquidating his Indiana businesses, converting his empire into gold jewelry and bonds. Sarah Coleman's illness had been nothing more than a cover to slowly exit public life and begin preparations to disappear. By summer of 1878, they planned to be gone. Their final sale of 23 children would fund early retirement, free rich and untouchable. They hadn't just prepared to run. They had escape routes, false identities, allies in Chicago, St. Louis, even California. One letter even outlined a plan to remove liabilities, a euphemism Ellen immediately recognized. They were prepared to kill anyone who threatened their escape. Time was collapsing. Ellen now understood. If she didn't act immediately, 23 more children would vanish into a vast, faceless network, gone forever. Not only that justice itself would be denied. No trials, no names, no headlines. Just another mystery quietly forgotten. This was no longer a moral dilemma. It was a race. Ellen Hartwell, alone, afraid and burning with righteous fury, held the truth in her hands. What she did next would decide the fate of dozens of children, and perhaps her own. The weight of truth nearly broke her. For Ellen Hartwell, the worst part wasn't what she had discovered. It was knowing she was the only one who had, and if she hesitated, if she failed, 23 more children would vanish. The decision tore at her act too soon, and the conspirators might scatter untouched, their empire rebuilt elsewhere. Wait too long, and those children, bright, trusting students she'd come to love, would be gone forever. But time was slipping, and the walls were closing in. Margaret Wilson had just announced their most ambitious excursion. Yet, a month-long biblical tour traveling as far as Philadelphia, possibly Boston. 23 children selected. 23 families thrilled. Ellen saw it for what it truly was, the final harvest. After that trip, Margaret, Sarah, and Robert would vanish, wealthy, hidden, protected. And Cedar Creek's children would become another generation of silent ghosts. But what could she do? The local sheriff owed his job to Robert Hayes. The Methodist hierarchy had pinned their reputation to Cedar Creek's success. Even hinting at such accusations could destroy her life, her career, her soul, and yet she could not stay silent. These children were not numbers in a ledger. They were Michael, who could recite psalms from memory. Josephine, who had just learned to read. Daniel, who made paper boats from hymn sheets. She saw their faces when she tried to sleep. She heard their laughter echoing in the halls where so many others had already vanished. Her breaking point came quietly when Ellen realized that Sarah Coleman's illness, the excuse for her treatment in Chicago, was nothing more than a smokescreen for the final massive sale. Everything, the letters, the timing, the secrecy, confirmed it. The clock had run out. So, on the stormy night of March 28, 1878, Ellen Hartwell broke into the basement of First Methodist Church one last time. But this time, she didn't come to discover. She came to steal. She took everything. The ledger with names, prices, and destinations. Sarah's journal of psychological control. Dozens of forged letters. The coded contracts and correspondence with urban traffickers. She knew taking them would alert the conspirators. But she prayed the truth finally laid bare would be impossible to ignore. It was a race against time. And she had one shot. Margaret Wilson discovered the theft the next morning. Her response, panic. The final excursion was moved up by a full week. The destination was changed without notice. Bags were packed, tickets bought, and Cedar Creek's last group of children was ready to vanish. But Ellen rode through the night alone, her evidence bundled in a leather satchel. She galloped 30 miles to Noblesville, wind stinging her eyes, heart pounding in her throat. And by dawn, she was in the chambers of Circuit Judge William Marshall. The judge read her evidence in grim silence. No questions, no doubts, and then he acted. Marshall dispatched urgent telegrams to authorities in Chicago, Louisville, and St. Louis. Within hours, coordinated raids were underway. 11 children were found alive, scattered in factories, warehouses, boarding houses. Some bore injuries. Some were too scared to speak. But they were alive. The nightmare was unraveling. On March 30th, 1878, Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes were arrested at the train depot, suitcases stuffed with cash-forged identities in hand, just minutes from vanishing forever. Their arrest stunned Cedar Creek, a town that prided itself on faith, family, and righteousness, was now the site of America's most horrifying educational fraud. 50 children had vanished in 2 years, and no one had asked why. But one woman did. Ellen Hartwell, a substitute teacher with a spine of steel, risked her life to stop a machine that had consumed dozens of innocent souls. And while she could not save them all, she ensured their stories were not erased. What followed the arrests was a reckoning Cedar Creek would never forget. The investigation, led by Detective Samuel Morrison of the Indiana State Police, uncovered not just a crime of greed, but a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The victims were not only the children, they were also the parents, widows, new immigrants, families drowning in debt or grief. These were the targets chosen not for their flaws, but for their pain. Because pain made them quiet. Pain made them grateful. Pain made them obedient. The disappearances were never sudden. They came gradually, quietly, each one wrapped in a ribbon of religious aspiration or educational opportunity. And without a single dramatic event, there was no rallying cry, only silence. Detective Morrison's report laid it bare. What occurred in Cedar Creek was not simply a failure of law. It was a failure of community. Most people, he wrote, had trusted too easily and questioned too little. But the most chilling discovery, some had noticed, at least 6 families had harbored quiet suspicions. They'd noticed the strange timing, the vague letters, the children who never returned, but they said nothing, because to speak out meant accusing respected church leaders. To doubt meant suggesting something rotten in the heart of the very institution they depended on, and so they buried their fears. And the silence grew. The Methodist Church's response was swift, but not in the way the community hoped. Rather than launch a transparent investigation, the denominational leadership moved to contain the scandal. Internal memos prioritized reputation over truth, optics over accountability. They feared what might happen if other communities looked too closely at their own Sunday school programs. And so the church that had enabled it, whether knowingly or not, built walls where there should have been open doors. But the true key to understanding how the horror endured for so long lay in the hands of Sarah Coleman. Her journal, Clinical Cold and Devastating, revealed how precisely the deception had been tailored. Every parent was told exactly what they most wanted to believe. Devout families were told their child had a religious calling. Struggling parents were told their child would learn valuable job skills. Ambitious mothers and fathers were promised social mobility for their families. Each lie was designed not to deceive, but to soothe. As detectives dug deeper, the truth expanded far beyond Indiana's borders. The Cedar Creek case wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of a multi-state criminal network with operations stretching across Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Missouri. Each site used the same techniques: false educational promises, trusted church figures, railroad-connected businessmen, and a web of traffickers who bought and sold children like commodities. The roots ran deep, all the way back to Philadelphia, where Margaret Wilson had supposedly worked in industrial schools. That was a lie. Her experience had come not from teaching children, but from recruiting them for illegal labor contracts for domestic servitude, for trafficking networks cloaked in religious rhetoric. Her relocation to Cedar Creek hadn't been a new start. It had been an expansion. Robert Hayes, the businessman hailed as a local saint, was in fact the network's logistical brain. His investments in grain mining and especially railroad shipping provided all the cover he needed. Children were transported across state lines, hidden among crates and inventory. Bills of lading were altered. Rail clerks were bribed. And law enforcement, seeing a respectable churchman with well-stamped papers, asked no questions. Together, Wilson, Coleman, and Hayes built a machine that fed on hope, ran on silence, and disguised its gears with God. And for 2 full years, it worked flawlessly, until a substitute teacher saw through the curtain. The financial investigation would unearth a final horror one that stunned even the most seasoned detectives. The documents taken from the Cedar Creek Church basement revealed only a fraction of the operation's true wealth. Behind forged ledgers and coded letters lay a web of hidden accounts properties, purchased under false names, and financial transactions laundered through front companies and out-of-state banks. When investigators tallied it, all the sum exceeded $50,000, an astronomical fortune in 1878. A fortune earned through the sale of children. That money had funded the expansion of the network, the bribery of officials, and the elaborate system of lies that kept the Cedar Creek program running for 2 full years. The conspiracy was never limited to one town. It had spread like a cancer across state lines and into city halls, courtrooms, and police stations. Sheriffs, railway clerks, judges, businessmen, all had accepted bribes. And in return, they had turned a blind eye while children were trafficked across the Midwest, hidden in cargo cars, moved under false names, and delivered to sweatshops and households like parcels. The Cedar Creek network didn't just sell children. It bought silence. And for years, it worked. When the arrests came, rescue operations were launched in 4 states. The effort was massive, coordinated, and often heartbreaking. Of the 50 children who had vanished from Cedar Creek, only 18 were found. Some had been so deeply absorbed into factories and homes that identifying them was nearly impossible. Others had been moved so many times that all records were lost. But worse than the paperwork was the damage. Doctors and social workers who examined the recovered children found malnutrition signs of physical abuse and permanent injuries from industrial accidents, missing fingers from machinery, scars and bruises from repeated beatings, lung damage from dust and fumes, stunted growth from chemical exposure, delayed development due to trauma and isolation. Some of the rescued children had spent months, even years, in dangerous factories, textile mills, and domestic servitude. They had not just suffered, they had been taught to believe they deserved it. Their testimonies revealed a nightmare beyond physical suffering, one of psychological warfare. They told me, "My parents didn't want me," one child whispered, "that I was sold because I was bad." Many had been told their families had given them away because they were burdens, because they sinned, because God willed it. They were warned that escape would bring punishment, that even asking for help would bring harm to their families. Some children resisted rescue, terrified they would be beaten or worse for leaving their assigned posts. It took days, sometimes weeks, to convince them they were safe, and some were never found. At least 12 children had died victims of disease abuse and industrial accidents. Their deaths were never reported. No graves were marked, no records filed, and no one asked questions. Corrupt officials ensured those children simply vanished from the books as if they had never lived at all. The trials of Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes became national sensations. Courtrooms in Indiana were packed with journalists, clergy educators, and grieving families. The prosecution presented a devastating case built on Ellen Hartwell's stolen documents, intercepted correspondence, and the fragile, trembling voices of rescued children. The public wanted answers. The public wanted blood. Margaret Wilson tried to present herself as a misguided visionary, a woman who believed she was offering poor children a better life. That facade collapsed quickly. Her personal financial records, along with glowing letters from criminal partners praising the quality of merchandise, revealed the truth. Margaret hadn't acted out of charity. She had acted out of pure greed, and she had used the church to do it. Sarah Coleman's role proved harder to prosecute. Psychological abuse wasn't yet recognized in legal statutes. Her carefully written notes, the manipulation, the conditioning, the spiritual gaslighting shocked the court, but lacked precedent. She was described by one prosecutor as a woman who used love like a knife. But even as justice approached, nothing could erase what had already been lost. Cedar Creek was never the same. An entire town had watched 50 children disappear and said nothing. Some out of fear, some out of trust, most out of silence. Sarah Coleman's defense team argued that her care for the children had been genuine, if tragically misguided. They portrayed her as a devoted educator whose emotional attachment clouded her judgment. But the evidence told a different story. Her journal, meticulous and chilling, revealed not affection, but systematic psychological manipulation crafted with cold precision. In the end, the jury was convinced. Her actions were not merely misguided, they were criminal. Robert Hayes' trial focused on his financial and logistical role in the trafficking network. His attorneys painted him as a legitimate businessman, caught in something he didn't fully understand. But the prosecution presented financial records, coded correspondence and testimony that left no room for doubt. Hayes had not just funded the operation, he had helped plan it. His conviction on multiple counts of conspiracy, kidnapping, and trafficking resulted in the longest prison sentence of all three conspirators. But even as justice was served, the trials exposed devastating gaps in existing laws. The prosecution had been forced to rely on fraud, conspiracy, and kidnapping statutes, laws never designed to address systemic interstate child trafficking. There were no federal protections for trafficked children, no specialized investigative procedures, no oversight for faith-based educational programs. And while the horror of Cedar Creek would later contribute to the evolution of national child protection laws, true reform would take decades. The Methodist Church's response was equally troubling. Rather than launch a deep internal investigation, church officials focused on damage control. They insisted that Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes had deceived the church just as they had deceived the town. Technically, they weren't wrong. But in refusing to examine institutional failures, they allowed the conditions that enabled the conspiracy to remain unchallenged. There had been no oversight, no verification of the Sunday school excursions, no safeguards to protect vulnerable families, and worst of all, there was no meaningful outreach to victims' families. For many parents, this silence was a final betrayal. They had trusted the church with their children, and when the truth came out, that same church offered no apology, no help, no healing. Local law enforcement fared no better. Sheriff Thomas Bradley's internal review found that multiple warnings and reports had been ignored or dismissed during the 2-year span of the conspiracy. Political influence, professional negligence, and social pressure to protect church leaders had combined to form a perfect storm of failure. Railroad companies, whose trains had carried trafficked children across state lines, also escaped meaningful accountability. Though individual employees had accepted bribes, no systemic reforms were enacted. There were no new ID requirements, no improved oversight, no safeguards to prevent it from happening again. And what of Ellen Hartwell, the woman who uncovered it all? To some, she was a hero. To others, a traitor who had destroyed their town's reputation. In Cedar Creek, she was blamed for the shame, not the crime. The whispers, the stares, the subtle exclusion, it became unbearable. Ellen was eventually forced to leave the town she had saved. The weight of what she had uncovered never left her. She had saved 23 children, but 32 others had vanished, swallowed into a network that may have spanned the entire nation. Some were rescued, some were never found, some were dead, and Ellen Hartwell would carry all of them with her for the rest of her life. The knowledge that she might have prevented further disappearances by acting sooner created a lifelong burden of guilt for Ellen Hartwell, one that no amount of logic or reasoning could ever fully erase. Her courageous actions had brought justice, but they came at a devastating personal cost. Professionally, Ellen's career was irreparably damaged. Many educational institutions viewed her not as a hero, but as a disruptive force, someone who had crossed professional boundaries by investigating her own colleagues and superiors. In a time when deference to authority was valued more than due diligence, Ellen's insistence on oversight and accountability was seen as subversive. Her attempts to introduce safeguards and verification procedures in later teaching positions were often met with suspicion or resistance. Administrators preferred traditional approaches based on trust, not documentation, and considered Ellen's ideas unnecessary or even insulting. Socially, she became an outcast. Though some hailed her as a heroine, others saw her as a grim reminder of the town's darkest chapter. She never married, partly because potential suitors were deterred by her notoriety, and partly because her experience had left her deeply distrustful of people's motives and claims. She spent the rest of her life drifting between teaching posts across Indiana and neighboring states, never staying in one place long enough to build the kinds of close community ties that had once betrayed her so cruelly. Yet despite the personal toll, Ellen never stopped fighting. Throughout her remaining years, she advocated tirelessly for educational reform and child protection policies. Her speeches and writings emphasized the need for institutional oversight, standardized verification procedures, systematic monitoring of all child-focused programs. Though her proposals were rarely adopted during her lifetime, her persistence laid the groundwork for reforms that would come decades later. The Cedar Creek case itself sent shockwaves far beyond Indiana. The news coverage of the trials and Ellen's investigation brought national attention to the problem of child trafficking, especially in rural communities where trust in religious institutions often left families vulnerable. Still, without sustained pressure or reform, this public awareness faded. No sweeping federal laws were passed. No central agency was created. The momentum was lost. Within the Methodist Church, however, the scandal left a lasting scar. Although no immediate comprehensive reforms followed, the case prompted denominational leaders to begin quietly increasing oversight of child-centered programs. New guidelines, periodic reviews, and more cautious appointments eventually became more common, driven less by moral awakening and more by fear of legal exposure and reputational harm. These incremental changes, while far from sufficient, may have prevented similar large-scale abuses in other communities. For Cedar Creek, however, the price was steep. The scandal shattered the town's once proud image as a center of moral and educational excellence. Business investment dried up. Families moved away, especially those who had lost children or felt tainted by association. The town began a slow decline, fading from a modest industrial hub into an impoverished, forgotten place on the map. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies across multiple states used the Cedar Creek tragedy as a catalyst for change. The case had revealed the dangers of isolated jurisdictions and the urgent need for interstate coordination. Though major reform wouldn't come until the 20th century, the Cedar Creek case helped build support for future legislation and planted the seed for eventual federal involvement in child welfare and anti-trafficking efforts. For the rescued children, outcomes varied widely. Some blessed with supportive families and resilient spirits managed to rebuild their lives. They became farmers, teachers, clerks, quiet survivors of unspeakable trauma. Others were not so lucky. Physical injuries, psychological scars, and a lifetime of mistrust haunted many. With no national support system for survivors of trafficking, their futures often depended on nothing more than family resources or the kindness of strangers. 20 years after the arrests, a follow-up investigation attempted to trace the fates of the 50 children who had vanished from Cedar Creek. The results were sobering. 18 had been rescued and returned home. 12 were confirmed dead victims of abuse, neglect, or industrial accidents. 20 remained unaccounted for their fates, lost in the shadowy underworld of 19th century child labor and human trafficking. The investigation ultimately concluded that most of the missing children had likely perished, lost to industrial accidents, disease, or abuse. Yet, in the absence of reliable documentation, their true fates remain a haunting mystery. Financial records revealed a staggering truth. The conspirators' total profits exceeded $75,000, an astronomical figure in the 1870s, placing them among the wealthiest criminals in American history. Much of that money was never recovered, hidden away in untraceable accounts and shadowy investments far beyond the reach of 19th century investigative tools. For the victims' families, there was no justice in wealth. They received no meaningful compensation, and many spent the rest of their lives trapped in the same poverty that had made them vulnerable in the first place. Margaret Wilson died in prison in 1884 after serving only 6 years of her 20-year sentence. Sarah Coleman, released on grounds of ill health in 1885, simply disappeared. No reliable records exist of her whereabouts or actions after her release. Robert Hayes served 12 years, walked free in 1890, and eventually resettled in California under an assumed name, where he lived until his death in 1903. Other members of the trafficking network met mixed fates. Some escaped justice, entirely fleeing westward into lawless territories. Others received light sentences, a reflection of the era's limited understanding of human trafficking and systemic abuse. With no centralized oversight or interjurisdictional coordination, the full scope of the network was never uncovered. More than a century has passed, yet the tragedy of Cedar Creek still echoes through time. The case lays bare a terrifying truth that trusted institutions can become instruments of unimaginable evil when oversight fails and accountability is ignored. What made this operation successful wasn't some criminal genius. It was something far more familiar: our collective desire to trust, to look away, to avoid uncomfortable truths. The community of Cedar Creek, like so many others, was undone, not by malice, but by willful blindness, deference to authority, and the seductive comfort of believing that good people could do no harm. The manipulation employed by Sarah Coleman shows how easily trust can be weaponized, especially when children are taught to obey without question. Her methods weren't advanced by today's standards, but they were brutally effective. Children were told their families had abandoned them, that their suffering was deserved, and that silence was not only necessary, but holy. The very religious faith that should have protected them was twisted into a tool for compliance and submission. And yet, Amid this darkness, there was light. Ellen Hartwell, the substitute teacher who exposed it all, stood alone against the storm. She risked everything, her job, her reputation, her safety, to protect children she barely knew. That kind of moral courage is rare, and society then as now does not reward it easily. Many in Cedar Creek saw Ellen not as a savior, but as a troublemaker, someone who brought shame on their town. The hostility she faced drove her away. She never married, never stayed long in one place again, always wary, always watching. She had saved 23 children, but could not save the 32 who vanished before her discovery. The weight of that failure haunted her to the end of her life. Still, Ellen never stopped fighting. She spent the rest of her career advocating for education reform, institutional oversight, and child protection. Though many of her recommendations were ignored in her lifetime, her work contributed to the slow evolution of safer, more accountable systems. The Cedar Creek tragedy left deep scars. Its economic toll was lasting. Businesses withdrew, families left, and Cedar Creek declined from a proud industrial town to a quiet, forgotten community. But the impact didn't end there. Across the Midwest, law enforcement agencies used the case as a wake-up call, a justification for building better interstate coordination, a step toward the modern frameworks we have today. And what of the children? Of the 50 who disappeared, 18 were rescued, 12 were confirmed dead, and 20 were never found. Some survivors rebuilt their lives, others never recovered, and some tragically resisted rescue, so deeply conditioned to believe they deserved their suffering that they could not recognize freedom when it came. The final report on the Cedar Creek case closed with a sobering truth. The greatest evil was not the trafficking itself, but the fact that it succeeded so easily. It thrived because communities trusted blindly, because institutions chose reputation over responsibility, and because the crimes were committed in the name of good. What would you have done in Ellen's place? Would you have had the strength to speak when everyone else was silent? The tragedy of Cedar Creek is not just a story about the past. It's a warning for now and for the future. Because while the methods of exploitation may change, the vulnerabilities remain the same. Economic desperation, parental hope, deference to authority, and our human tendency to believe in comforting lies. If you've made it to the end of this story, then you're someone who refuses to look away. So share this with someone who needs to hear it. Let Ellen Hartwell's story be remembered, not just for what she uncovered, but for what she stood for. Because in a world where the greatest evil often wears a respectable face, vigilance is the price of protecting the innocent.